the family subscribes to a racehorse theory of human development.
When you connect two racehorses, you usually end up with a fast horse.
Secretariat doesn't produce slow horses.
They believe that there are superior people, and that if you put together the genes of a superior woman and a superior man, you get a superior offspring.
You have to have the right genes.
I have a certain gene. I'm a gene believer.
Do we believe in the gene thing? I mean, I do.
I have great genes and all that stuff, which I'm a believer in.
Well, I think I was born with a drive for success.
I was born with a certain intellect. The fact is, you have to be born and blessed with something up here. God helped me by giving me a certain brain. It's this. It's not my salesmanship.
It's what?
This. You know what that is? It's the brain power.
I have Ivy League education, smart guy.
I have like a very, very high aptitude.
I'm pretty good at English. I always did very nicely in English.
I mean, like, I'm a smart person. You're born a fighter, and I've seen a lot of people, they want to fight, but they can't.
Some people cannot genetically handle pressure.
I always said winning is somewhat maybe innate. Maybe it's just something you have. You know, you have the winning gene. Frankly, it'd be wonderful if you could develop it, but I'm not so sure you can. You know, I'm proud to have that German blood. There's no question about it. Great stuff.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting. And it only makes common sense. It only makes common sense. They're sending us not the right people. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East.
But this was Albert Johnson, a backbench congressman from Washington state, whose whole public profile had been built around the defense of the white race and the threat that non-white immigrants posed to white civilization in the United States. Albert Johnson, at home in Washington state, he ran a rabble-rousing anti-immigrant newspaper called The Home Defender. He bragged about having been part of mob violence that chased immigrants out of Washington state and out of the United States into Canada. And so he had been a rabble-rouser and an orator on that pet issue for decades, but he'd never really wielded any national power on the subject until Woodrow Wilson got shellacked in the 1918 midterm elections, and Albert Johnson's party, the Republican Party, took over leadership of the Congress. And that is what made it possible for Albert Johnson to take real power. He became chairman of the Committee on Immigration and Naturalization. It was his life's dream to be in charge of something like that. And he did what he could with it. Soon after he took over, the House of Representatives Committee on Immigration and Naturalization hired themselves an expert eugenics agent. Albert Johnson, the chairman, in addition to serving in Congress, he had become the president of the Eugenics Research Association of America. And once he was chairman of that committee, he brought on one of the officers from the Eugenics Research Association, this guy Harry Laughlin, to become an expert eugenics consultant to the Immigration Committee in Congress. And together, these two eugenicists, they got to work. In 1922, Harry Laughlin created this chart. Ooh, look, science, it's a chart. You can see diagonal there. That's the watermark of Truman State University. They've preserved this document online as part of their History of Eugenics project. But this is a chart that Harry Laughlin created when he was the expert eugenics agent for that congressional committee. What this chart purports to show is the relative social inadequacy of various immigrant races in the United States. What counts as social inadequacy? Well, according to the chart, that includes feeble-mindedness, insanity, crime, epilepsy, tuberculosis, blindness, deafness, deformity, and dependency. And then the chart ranks your likelihood of being any of those things or having any of those things based on your national origin. By 1924, Wilson was gone. It was a new president, Calvin Coolidge, and he signed an anti-immigration bill that was written by Albert Johnson. It was called the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924. Johnson was the author in the House, Reed was the author in the Senate. And it was a eugenics bill. It was a bill to protect America from a stream of alien blood. It was a bill to stop American civilization from descending into barbarism. That 1924 bill, it restricted immigration dramatically, but also in a very specifically targeted way, it banned immigration from Asian countries altogether. It defined an Asian exclusion zone from which you were not allowed to come to this country. It targeted Jews, it targeted Italians, it targeted other unworthy populations that tended to be unpopular with the ascendant clan at the time. And it did so through a kind of a neato math trick. The Johnson-Reed anti-immigrant formula that they put into law in 1924, it limited immigrants based on national origin, but it did it in this very specific way. The numbers of immigrants who would be allowed in now were based on the number of people of that national origin who had made it into this country by 1890. They went all the way back to the 19th century to pick a date that they decided was white enough in American history to try to bring the country back to. And you know, you can look back on that now and see how radical it was. I mean, looking at it from almost any contemporaneous angle. But what is inarguable about that law is what's clear in the contemporaneous record about how it was argued. It was nothing subtle about it. It was an explicitly racist law. It was explicitly race-based in its intention. There was no secret about that. That was openly the way the legislation was talked about and argued about. The senator who wrote the bill with Albert Johnson, a Rhode Island senator named David Reed, he was quoted in the New York Times saying that thanks to that bill, quote, "The racial composition of America at this time is thus made permanent." Another senator named Ellison Durant Smith got up on the Senate floor to spell out why the Johnson-Reed 1924 immigration bill was getting his vote. He said, quote, "It seems to me that the point of this measure is that the time has arrived when we should shut the door. Thank God we have in America perhaps the largest percentage of any country in the world of the pure, unadulterated Anglo-Saxon stock. It is for the preservation of that splendid stock that has characterized us that I would make this not an asylum for the oppressed of all countries, but a country to assimilate and perfect that splendid type of manhood that has made America the foremost nation in her progress and in her power." Anybody looking at immigration policy in this country and where we've been has to know what that was all about. That really was eugenics.
In 7 years, we'll have the highest percentage of Americans, non-native born, since the founding of the Republic. And some people think, well, we've always had these numbers, but it's not so. This is very unusual. It's a radical change. And in fact, when the numbers reached about this high in 1924, the President and Congress changed the policy, and it slowed down immigration significantly. And we then assimilated through the 1965 and created really the solid middle class of America with assimilated immigrants. And it was good for America.
Good morning. I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded. The DACA program was implemented in 2012 and essentially provided a legal status for recipients for a renewable 2-year term, work authorization, and other benefits, including participation in the Social Security program to 800,000 mostly adult illegal aliens. The policy was implemented unilaterally to great controversy and legal concern after Congress rejected legislative proposals to extend similar benefits on numerous occasions to this same group of illegal aliens. In other words, the executive branch, through DACA, deliberately sought to achieve what the legislative branch specifically refused to authorize on multiple occasions. Such an open-ended circumvention of immigration laws was an unconstitutional exercise of authority by the executive branch. The effect of this unilateral executive amnesty, among other things, contributed to a surge of minors at the southern border that yielded terrible humanitarian consequences. It also denied jobs to hundreds of thousands of Americans by allowing those same illegal aliens to take those jobs. We inherited from our founders and have advanced an unsurpassed legal heritage, which is the foundation of our freedom, our safety, and our prosperity. As Attorney General, it is my duty to ensure that the laws of the United States are enforced and that the constitutional order is upheld. To have a lawful system of immigration that serves the national interest, we cannot admit everyone who would like to come here. Therefore, the nation must set and enforce a limit on how many immigrants we admit each year, and that means all cannot be accepted. This does not mean they are bad people or that our nation disrespects or demeans them in any way. It means we are properly enforcing our laws as Congress has passed them.
White supremacists and neo-Nazis and white nationalists did not start rebranding themselves as the alt-right because Donald Trump got elected president. They didn't also come into existence because Donald Trump was elected president. The Heil Hitler, let's make a white homeland corner of American white extremism, it didn't suddenly spring out of the toilet it usually lives in because this guy got elected. The white supremacist nightmare edge of American politics, they started rebranding themselves as the alt-right years ago. And I hereby re-up for discussion the fact that well before this president moved on from reality TV, it was the Republican Party in Congress, before Trump, that started to insinuate these guys into otherwise mainstream Republican politics.
Who stands for us? Have you ever wondered, why isn't there an organization that works for us? From African Americans to illegal immigrants, from lesbians to left-handers, every ethnic and interest group has its own lobby or cultural foundation. The exception, of course, is white Americans.
This is the white supremacist the white nationalist think tank group. They call themselves the National Policy Institute. Their slogan, you can see at the top there, for our people, our culture, our future. And when they say our, they are being really, really specific about who they mean.
As long as whites continue to avoid and deny their own racial identity, at a time when almost every other racial and ethnic category is rediscovering and asserting its own, whites will have no chance to resist their dispossession. This is our challenge. This is our calling. Won't you join us?
Starting immediately after the presidential election, there was all this talk that the Republican Party was finally going to go along, or they were finally going to help see into law reform of our nation's royally screwed up immigration system. The writing was on the wall, right? After losing the presidency again, and losing seats in the House, and losing seats in the Senate, the writing was on the wall. The Republican Party had to get right with Latinos, at least, with Latino voters, and the way it was going to do it was by supporting immigration reform, finally. And even though the Beltway narrative is supposedly that Republicans see the light and Republicans support this now, it is really not clear that enough Republicans do support it that it's going to pass. Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III of Alabama introduced 49 separate amendments to the bill today. And that is not because he's trying to help it along. And the most powerful conservative think tank in the country is really, really against it. The Heritage Foundation is leading the conservative opposition to anything getting done to fix the immigration system. And this is where the white supremacist problem comes in. So yesterday, it was Dylan Matthews at the Washington Post who looked up the credentials of the people who wrote the anti-immigration reform study for Heritage. And they found that one of the co-authors for the big Heritage study on this issue did his doctoral dissertation on American immigration policy, and specifically on the question of how we should shape our immigration policy to account for the fact that Latinos are so dumb as a race. I'm only barely paraphrasing. The dissertation describes Latino immigrants as generally having an IQ that is, quote, substantially lower than that of the white native population. Quote, immigrants living in the U.S. today do not have the same level of cognitive ability as natives. Quote, no one knows whether Hispanics will ever reach IQ parity with whites, but the prediction that new Hispanic immigrants will have low IQ children and grandchildren is difficult to argue against. So not only are Latinos intellectually inferior to whites, but of course they breed. Ugh. It's disgusting, right? To be clear, this guy with the thesis that white people are just naturally smarter, he isn't some temp that the Heritage Foundation just bumped into and it turns out he has this embarrassing past. He has a titled position at the Heritage Foundation. He's a senior policy analyst for the Heritage Foundation. And even as they try to disavow his dissertation as if that's in his student past, that's the one little problem with him, today we learned, thanks to some digging by Chris Moody at Yahoo News, that this guy's whole record of public output is this same kind of stuff. I mean, here's another bylined article from him. This one's from March 2010. Model minority? Question mark? It's kind of a rhetorical question. You get the implication, right? Quote, Hispanics are in fact substantially more likely than whites to commit serious crimes. These findings are not due to age differences or immigration violations or other statistical artifacts. The reality of Hispanic crime should be one of the many factors we consider when setting immigration policy. That's not from some dissertation that somebody had to dig out of the Harvard Library. That's on the online machine. Specifically, that's on the online machine at Alternative.right.com. And this is the world where the Heritage Foundation went to find an author for their study of immigration reform. And wouldn't you know it, it turns out their study concludes that it is a terrible idea to reform immigration. I should also tell you that report, that Hispanics are parasites report, and therefore we shouldn't let them into the country, that report is still, tonight, proudly displayed on the website of the Heritage Foundation. It's still there.